tracks transit station or within 50 feet of electrical lines. And you cannot fly it over private property without permission. Certainly not flying it over and lingering. So the law is really silent on whether these state and federal restrictions on the use of drones apply to law enforcement when they're engaged in some crime interdiction or some emergency. Again, as I said, from a practical perspective, I don't see there being much actual risk, but you might get some crazy prosecutor who wants to make a name for him or herself and believes there's a technical violation of law and prosecute. Okay, so the FAA, one of the good things they've done is they've created an app. It's called Before You Fly. So this is an app you can download it on your phone, and it will give you your real-time location where you are, and will tell you all of the no-fly zones around. All the airports, all these national restricted airspace, all temporary flight things, all heliports and things of that nature. That's where I learned that there are a lot of heliports on tops of buildings in Salt Lake County. So any operator, government operator of a drone ought to become very conversant with that app.
But that just gives you the federal, it doesn't give you...
No, it gives you the state as well. Yeah, it gives you the state as well. Now, how accurate it is, I couldn't verify on the state side, but it purports to include all the restricted spaces, including those that have been imposed by states. All right, let's move on to managing risks. At least as far as the legal risks are concerned, they're most likely to arise in one of four areas: compliance risks, operating risks, security risks, and then privacy and trespass issues. And this is the one that gets a lot of media attention, and it's a serious issue. All right, so let's talk about compliance risk. So if you fail as a government entity, fail to comply with an FAA requirement, it could result in what they call a warning letter, a notice, a letter of correction. They could implement civil penalties and fines, and they could, if you're operating under a certificate of authorization, they could revoke or suspend that. That's a pretty serious sanction. They have done it, but those have all been with private operators. I'm not aware of any, or commercial operators. I'm not aware of any governmental entity that's had their COA revoked. But dozens and dozens of individuals and companies that have gotten a certificate to operate have had them revoked, and there have been fines ranging from just a few $100s to $1.9 million that was imposed against a Chicago company that used drones for aerial photography, which is a huge growing use of drones. So there is some compliance risk, and obviously the state law, there's really no compliance component of the laws there, but the risk there is criminal prosecution through operating in a manner inconsistent with the state law. All right, so let's talk about operating risks. I think the key takeaway is that the same risks that government would run when operating any piece of government-owned property, whether it's the garbage truck, or the road equipment, or the police vehicle, or whatever it may be, those same risks will apply to the drone. If the operator is negligent in operating the drone, if the operator operates it in a reckless or negligent manner and that results in injury to someone, the county or the governmental entity may face potential liability. That's why it's very important to have proper training for your pilot command or your drone operator. And also make sure that you keep proper records for maintenance of the drones and things of that nature. People tend to think drones are toys. Certainly the ones that you buy for your kids for Christmas, those are toys. But drones are mobile computers. They are exceedingly sophisticated pieces of equipment. Not everyone understands them. There are lots of off-the-shelf drones that are being sold to governments. Governments need to have a level of sophistication about them. Now, if you're going to allow operators to fly on government-owned property, in fact, I think, wasn't there one of you I know said that you contemplate having a drone park? Is that anyone here who's in attendance? One of you responded to the survey and said, yes, we're going to have a drone park where our citizens can come and fly their drones. Well, that's a policy decision that the government entity can make. And one would think that you would want to have reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on when people can fly their drones in your park, and under what circumstances and what have you. But if you, and yet the state government said you can't enact any ordinance that regulates that. So, maybe you could have a post-it notice that says, you can't operate it in a reckless manner, can't operate it, you must comply with all state and federal laws, you must assume the risk, probably want to notify users of the park who are playing volleyball or softball or whatever, that there are drones. And you can imagine that drones in an equestrian park don't kind of mix too well, horses and drones. So it's a complicated area, and I wish I had a lot of guidance for you. But the state has, in their wisdom, has said you as local entities cannot regulate the use of drones by private citizens. My advice, and I'm not your lawyer, my advice is you talk to your county lawyer and tell them from a risk management perspective, you at a minimum need to have some rules and regulations posted in the park or the area where you're going to, people might be flying drones. You're going to get a lot of complaints from citizens. If someone's flying their drone in the park and it's right next and nearby neighbors, because there's noise problems with some drones, they have a camera. So it's a significant issue. A lot of states and local entities are beginning to buy coverage, insurance company, for any liability that results from the operation of a drone. So you might want to consider that not only for first-party loss, but also third-party loss when a drone, someone gets injured on, say, your county park. The person who's injured is most likely going to sue not only the drone operator, but most likely going to sue you as well, because you didn't have reasonable precautions to make sure that people weren't flying too large of a that you weren't making sure that the operator was complying with state and federal law. So you might want to just consider that. Okay, any other operating risks other than privacy trespassing? We'll talk about that as a sole issue. Any other operating risks that any of you have thought about or concerned about? How many people here from law enforcement? Okay, that's why I'm, yeah, okay. If there were law enforcement folks here, I tell you that they're using them a lot. Okay, let's talk about security concerns. And I know you've got your after lunch speaker is addressing cyber risk for governments. Here's a niche area of cyber risk, because if your drone is equipped with a video camera, and most of them are, that's one of the primary uses to have them take a video. That's collecting data, and it's usually probably being transmitted over the internet to a server back at the home base where it's being operated. So it's collecting a lot of data. What happens to that data? How is it stored? Who has access to it? Do you have reasonable safeguards in place to avoid it being hacked and things of that nature? That all could be of potential concern. Of a more immediate concern in terms of safety is most drones are operated through radio waves, and they can be intercepted. And someone can either gain control, some third party gain control of the drone, take over its control and fly it away or crash it into someone or something or whatever, or can block the radio waves, which means the drone will crash. And obviously, a lot of these drones are big, and can be up to 55 pounds, and 50 pounds falling from the air can be a definite safety hazard. So, as you as risk managers are interfacing with your procurement folks, whether they're doing an RFP or buying a drone off the shelf, one of the things you want to raise with them is, are there sufficient anti-hacking protocols in place for the operation of the drone? There's a cost to that, a financial cost. That costs a lot more to have these cyber protections in place, but from a risk management perspective, they're really almost a necessity. The last thing you want is to have a county, you're operating a drone, someone hijacks it and uses it for some illegal purpose or to cause injury to someone else. So that there's a unique set of security concerns relating to the operation of drones. Safety concerns with protecting them from being hijacked or disabled while they're in the air, and then what you do with the information that you collect. You've got a drone, it's flying to search for someone, and they're taking video of lots of people as they're going along. And fly over that house, and there's Sally swimming nude in her swimming pool. She's got big high fences all around. She has an expectation of privacy that nobody's going to be peeking in on her. You fly over, maybe it's not a big deal, but if suddenly someone makes a grandma request for all the footage that was taken when you rescued, that dramatic rescue of that 8-year-old boy who was lost, you turn over all the footage and there's Sally swimming nude in her backyard pool or what have you. Sure, we can all conjure up a few privacy and trespass issues. So, yes.
One more question. There's a company named DJI that has about 80% of the drone market.
That's right.
And it's been revealed that photos and video and everything that drone is taking is being uploaded to the DJI servers, and they could even be in China. So how do the military just dropped buying all DJI products?
Yeah, that's a big issue on whether DJI has denied that they're retaining that information, and they've said that using it just for to get more data about how the drones are being used and what context and whatever. But we haven't heard the end of that. But that's a great example. Once data is in a digital form, it is subject to being hacked. It is subject to being shared with people which it should not be shared, with whom it should not be shared. So this is a significant, that's both a security and a privacy issue. So drones themselves are not inherently invasive of privacy. but they can use technology that they can be equipped with technology that is potentially privacy invasive. Video cameras obviously can be privacy invasive. And look how small some of these drones are. Look how small those are. And some of those drones have small cameras. And they're not high quality. The technology is dramatically improving. Licensed drones can be equipped with license plate readers. All sorts of issues about tracking people and surveillance with license plate readers. Thermal. Pardon? You don't. But you could see a person on a hilltop that's monitoring a protest gathering, and they're watching the whole protest, and they've got drones circulating that are videotaping who's there and who's not, videotaping all the cars that come in and go. You could have thermal imaging devices. So there's a Supreme Court case that says that law enforcement cannot use a thermal imaging device to basically peer into someone's home absent a search warrant. But drones could be equipped with thermal imaging devices as well. Night vision cameras. And the thing that has civil liberty adherents most concerned is using drones with facial recognition. So a drone comes and flies down, flies over the crowd, and is able to identify everyone who's there. Maybe they're protesting, they didn't have a permit, or what have you. So all sorts of Big Brother possibilities. Drones just magnify that, because you can have a drone that's flying so high that you cannot really detect it. Some drones are very quiet, some drones are noisy. So the FAA, these privacy risks have been heightened because the FAA set nary a peep when they issued their rules, nary a peep about privacy. In fact, they said, we are not going to regulate privacy because we're a public safety agency and we're not going to get into that. So as a consequence, states are beginning to enter that arena as well. One big issue in terms of civil liberties is the use of drones for prolonged surveillance. The U.S. Supreme Court has made it very clear that for law enforcement to put a GPS tracker on someone's car, they've got to get a search warrant to do that. But there's not been any cases relating to a drone that can have a huge swath of surveillance. The Ogden City, they applied for a certificate of authorization several years ago. They wanted to have a drone, but it was a drone that was capable of staying up in the sky for months at a time. It was solar powered, and it had a surveillance eye of high crime area on 25th Street. I grew up in Ogden. That used to be the notorious red light district. So I'm told, that's not personal experience. But high crime rate on 25th Street, and that's what they applied for. Was that way they could have continual surveillance. They could have less officers on the ground because they'd have someone there. They just didn't have enough manpower to be controlling that entire area. Well, they got tentative approval for it. Then they had a new police chief that got replaced the old one. Thought that was a bad idea and discontinued the program. But that's one possible use of law enforcement use, is to use a drone to conduct mass surveillance of either an area or a group of persons. And usually, the touchstone to privacy in terms of its legal protection is whether you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And when you're in a public space, you don't really have much of it's hard to argue that you've got an expectation of privacy when you're walking along the public streets or what have you. So a lot of law enforcement officials were saying instead of having 20 law enforcement officials deployed along the parade route or what have you, let's have one drone that can surveil it all, and then we can call law enforcement if they need it. An issue that's related to, a related privacy issue is this whole issue of information management, which we talked about. You need to have policies in place, just like I'm sure you have policies in place that govern access to your HR records and other data that you as a government entity collect. You need to have policies in place that relate to the collection, the use, the storage, and access to data that might be collected by a drone. Utah law imposes that requirement on law enforcement, but it's just silent on other non-law enforcement uses. You will need to think about how you're going to classify. One, you're going to need to think about whether you keep the video that you shot or whether you get rid of it within a certain period of time. How is it going to be classified? It could be evidence in a lawsuit. A citizen could make a grandma request for it. And if they wanted that dramatic video of the rescue, finding that lost boy, before you release that, you dang well make sure that that video Sally, in her backyard pool swimming nude, you redacted that. All right, so here's a good little cartoon that raises the issue about more and more people are being concerned that citizens will use drones. You probably in the back can't read that. Here's a little drone coming in the bedroom and says, "Oh no, my wife's drone." So these little drones, we can have a drone in here. If I had enough money, I would always have a little teeny drone flying around when I give these talks, and half of you wouldn't even know about it. Law enforcement is going to be increasingly called upon to handle citizens' complaints. There was a drone hovering outside my bathroom window, or there was a drone flying over my house, or there was a drone tracking my child as they walk to school, or what have you. You can imagine all sorts of different scenarios where a person could use a drone to harass a neighbor or otherwise invade their privacy. The law about, in most states, you have a right to defend yourself and your home if someone's trespassing on it. You can't use deadly force unless it's necessary to prevent serious harm to yourself or one of the persons in your home. But you can use self-help. The issue about what self-help can you use if a drone is trespassing on your property is an open issue. Here's a little cartoon that I can imagine is not too far-fetched. Here's the dad. "Ha! I blasted that freedom-killing NSA drone right out of the sky. Dad, that was Amazon delivering my new Xbox." So eventually, a county prosecutor is going to have to decide whether they're going to prosecute someone who shot down a $5,000 drone that was flying over someone's property. There have been at least a dozen prosecutions in other parts of the country where a homeowner believed that drone was trespassing on their property, and their view is that they own their land and the airspace all the way up. There was a very old U.S. Supreme Court case that said landowners own their property all the way up to infinity. That's been discredited, but landowners do have certain rights, at least up to maybe 400 feet, usable airspace. So you can raise pigeons and things of that nature and whatever. So if a drone were flying over and scaring your pigeons or what have you, but still 200 feet away, you might have a nuisance claim that you could make because you do have some rights to the usable airspace above your property. But it's just a few feet. It's not a huge. It's not certainly into infinity. So if someone flies the drone over you, you have a reason to believe they're videotaping you or what have you, can you shoot, get your shotgun out and shoot them down? There have been at least 12 prosecutions. A couple have been dismissed, but those that have actually gone to trial, in every instance, the homeowner has been found guilty of either of the crime of discharging a firearm in the city limits, or destroying and intentional destruction of another person's property, or what have you. So, but this is an issue that is that your governmental entities are going to have to deal with, because there are going to be more and more citizen complaints. So-and-so is violating the city or the county noise ordinance, or they're violating my privacy, or they're trespassing, or they're there'll be a lot more instances where government is going to have to be called upon to address these issues. And if you recall earlier, I noted that the state law now requires law enforcement to issue warnings when people have violated state law, and if necessary, prosecute them. Okay, we've only got about 15 minutes left, so let's talk about the final topic, which is a drone policy. Even though you will be prohibited by state law currently from enacting a rule or an ordinance that governs the private use of drones, you should have a policy, a written policy, that addresses your government use policy. So my view is that every government agency should have a written drone policy. Why? Well, you need it for compliance purposes, and you also need it to garner public support for your use of drones. A lot of the prevalent public view is they don't like government using drones, particularly law enforcement using drones, because they see it as an extension of Big Brother is now going to be watching where they go and what they do at all times. So today I'm just going to briefly talk about the need for a policy and what are some provisions that you ought to think about including in a policy. Obviously, a policy for an urban area will be much different than a policy in a rural area. So let's talk a little bit about some of the provisions that might be included in a policy. And some of these are for legal reasons, and some are to help garner public support. If the government can explain to the citizens why they are operating, why the government is operating drones, then that will go a long way toward getting public support. All right, so you ought to have a purpose statement. We're going to use this drone for wildlife management. We're going to use this drone for crowd control. We're going to use this drone for locating missing persons. If there are legitimate reasons, most citizens are going to be okay with government using a drone for a hostage situation or things of that nature. Just like a lot of people are okay with the militarization, if you will, of police, where police have battering rams and tanks and things of that nature, if they're being used to rescue a hostage or whatever. But just Officer Joe walking the street or coming in to visit the kids, if he's all looks like a military SWAT guy, people are a little concerned about it. So if you have a purpose statement, that will go along. It's probably a drone.
Cessna 172.
All right. So if you've got a purpose statement that is clear on why you're using it and what's the purpose for it, that will go a long way to getting public support. You should have a definition of the key terms, and that's been a huge issue on the federal arena. What is a aircraft, and how is that defined? It's very helpful, I think, to have both the permitted and the prohibited uses. You know already that there are some prohibited uses that the state legislature has imposed on you. You cannot have a weapon. You can't fly it near an airport, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all set out in Senate Bill 111. You can't use it for in aid of investigation unless you've got a search warrant. Make those things clear in your policy. That will go a long way for, one, compliance with state law, and two, garnering public support. This obviously would apply if you've got multiple drones, but even a single drone that's being operated in a smaller governmental unit, you need to have some command structure. So that not just everybody's operating that drone, you gotta make sure there's a true pilot command. You've got to oversee their use, that they are using it within the permitted uses, that they're not using it for other purposes. Just like you have policies in place that say personal use of county computers or county cars or things of that nature, you need to have a similar policy in place to oversee the use of drones. Obviously, you need some operating policies and procedures. That is pretty pretty self-evident. You need to address this issue of record keeping. What records are you going to keep? What data that the drone collects are you going to keep? How is it going to be stored? Is it encrypted? Are there other safeguards to prohibit unauthorized access or hijacking of that information? Related to that is, how are you going to classify all that data under grandma? The whole issue of how long you're going to keep the information. Citizens are going to be a lot less concerned if the data gets destroyed unless it's being used in a criminal investigation, in 1 day or 2 days, as opposed to, oh, it's going to be there forever. Security issues, reporting of accidents, maintenance, we'll go through these quickly, maintenance and the minimum drone specifications. Because some drones, if you want to use it for one purpose, the drone might not be really appropriate for that purpose. So your procurement managers need to understand what's the purpose of the drone, how is it going to be operated, who's going to be operating it, so that they make sure that the drone has the necessary specifications. Certification and training is obviously something that you need to do. That would be very important in defending a lawsuit where you get sued through the negligent operation of the drone. And then just like you have to decide, another issue would be that whether you will allow the government operator to use the government drone for commercial purposes. Like, I'll rent it. We've got a drone, not using a lot of it. Gee, I want to go do this. Can I rent it from the county to do it? So the use, and then the other related issue is whether you want to use a privately owned drone for government purposes. You're looking for someone or you're fighting a wildfire or whatever it might be, should you use a privately owned drone for that purpose? If you allow that, under what circumstances? And because you'll have all sorts of requirements that that are being complied with the government drone that you control. You may not know that with a privately owned drone. But you're going to have citizens who will want to lend you their drone or help in search and rescue or what have you. A policy also should have a clear, transparent policy on how you're going to handle citizens' complaints about government use and about private use. The state law obligates law enforcement to do that. You ought to have a policy, and maybe the policy is nothing more than it gets referred to the sheriff's office or what have you. But you ought to have in your policy that the citizens can read, and this ought to be a public document, your policy, how you're going to handle it when people complain about your use of the drone, or private citizens using a drone is somehow invasive on. And then finally, compliance with state and federal law. All right, so I'm almost out of time. I'm going to just give you run through some quick best practices that I think should be, if they're not part of your policy, they should certainly be part of the training for any government employee that's going to be operating a drone. These are in the, I'll go through them quickly. You can read them at your leisure. But basically, drone operators should try to give notice when they're collecting information. Because not every drone is going to have a video camera, and not every drone with a video camera is going to be recording. They also have sophisticated audio recording as well. So whenever information is being collected by the drone, it's best to give notice of that. So if you're going to be operating a drone over a park routinely, probably should have that notice be given on your website or posted on the park rules or things of that nature. Another best practice is don't collect data where a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So you're flying over to the canyon to help search for a missing child. Don't have the video being operated while you're flying over people's homes or what have you. Another good practice is just avoid persistent or prolonged surveillance. That's really going to get the citizens' hackles up if they believe that a drone is following them around or has them under some prolonged surveillance. Make reasonable efforts to minimize flying over private property. Again, these are best practices. They would be followed in all instances. A lot of them would not be followed in an emergency situation, but as a general best practice, that's something to keep in mind. You should retain information for as short a period of time as possible, only for the purposes for which it was collected. Drone operators shouldn't use any information collected for employment, credit, or healthcare purposes. And you think, well, how could that happen? We don't have time to talk about it, but it can. And there's a federal law that prohibits that. Not specifically addressed to drones, but for other reasons. Your HR people will know all about that. You should establish a process for people to complain and request deletion of that data that you gathered, maybe inadvertently or intentionally, about them. You should limit the sharing of the information. One of the things you ought to decide in your policy too is, are you going to share it with other governmental entities? And if so, under what circumstances? Are you going to require them to subpoena? Are you going to require them to have a search warrant? Or are you going to freely share that information? It's always a good idea, if you can, to take steps to de-identify any information that's released to the public, so that you're not releasing information that identifies a specific person, unless that's what you want to do, because this is, here's a suspect in a crime or whatever. And then obviously drone operators should always comply with federal laws. So the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, they've issued a set of best practices specifically addressed to addressing privacy and civil liberties issues. I'd suggest you take a look at that. All right, so the handouts, I've got handouts. There are 5 of them. I would encourage you to take those. They'll give you a little bit more information. All right, so what's the future like? Well, if I had a crystal ball, I probably wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today, but who knows what the next few years are going to bring us. But there's going to be a balancing act. It's going to be a balancing act between the federal government and the state and local governments. It's going to be a balancing act between privacy advocates and law enforcement. It'll be statutory. It'll be through the courts. The U.S. Supreme Court is yet to define any limits specifically applicable to drones, but it's only a matter of time before that happens. Okay, I've left 2 minutes for any questions. Yeah, this is the beginning of the discussion. This is not the answer to it. Yes.
Are there some sample drone policies out there, or do you have any?
Yes. In fact, if you just Google let's see, what's the national cities and municipalities organization? They've got one, I think, the National Association of Counties, the International Association of Police Chiefs. It's geared for law enforcement, but the Orange County Regional Government Association or something that has like 29 counties in southern Utah. They promulgated a model policy. So with a little bit of effort on the internet, you'll be able to find some sample policies. Obviously, you find that a lot of them are going to be better with things that are identified. But there's some resources out there for you. Any other questions? Yes.
Talk about you can't operate the roads with 5 miles.
Yes.
You talk about the 4 miles, what about small rural airports do you not have?
Great question.
They not even have fish space on.
Yeah, great question. Under the state law, you only have to get permission from a airport that has a control tower. Federal law doesn't have that exemption. It just says you shall not fly within 5 miles of the airport, 30 miles within the Reagan airport, regardless of whether. So there's another issue where state law and federal law might be compliant with state law, but you arguably might be in violation of federal law, and there's a conflict. Another area of conflict between federal and state laws. Great question. Okay, any other questions? All right, thanks very much.